Good morning. This is Dorothy Greco here, just outside of Boston. I wanted to talk a little bit today about how remembering God's faithfulness can help us in the present moment, but can also help us in thinking about where we're going next. So I want to start by reading this short section from Psalm 77. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on all your mighty deeds. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters, though your footprints were not seen. I just turned 60 recently, and I have actually been following Jesus for 40 years now. And in my experience, our histories play a very important role in our walk with God, particularly when life is difficult, such as fall of 2020, when probably most of us are dealing with some pretty intense shifts in our life, some irregularities, lots of disruption. And when we're in that kind of space for a prolonged time period, being able to think back on God's faithfulness can really help to steady us. 8 years ago, my husband Christopher and I were going through, I think I can say, at least up to this point, what was the most difficult season in our marriage. And it wasn't an internal issue that we were dealing with, it was external circumstances. And there were a lot of things that were really kind of falling apart and very difficult. As we were going through this, a lot of what got us through was remembering God's faithfulness to us in the past. We remembered how God helped us to forgive each other and to work through some pretty painful relational issues. The first time we were engaged, Christopher broke off our engagement. And that took a lot of work for us to get through and get to a place where we could again choose to love each other. We remembered how in the second year that we were married, we felt led to take a first-time homebuyers class in the city of Boston, and we didn't even know it at the time. But one of the perks of that was that we had no closing costs and only had to pay 5% down. And if that had been the case, we wouldn't have been able to purchase a home. We also recalled how our many church friends rallied around us in previous seasons that had been difficult. And the more we remembered, the more fortified we felt. I'm just going to quote a little section from Marriage in the Middle. To some degree, our pasts conjugate our present and our future tenses. We engage our memories in tandem with God, writes pastor and spiritual director Casey Tigrid, because they are the starting points for who we are now and who we have yet to become. And if you're not familiar with his book, as I recall, it's a really terrific book, and it's absolutely connected to this. So we're not necessarily bound by what has happened to us in the past, but our past definitely shapes both our todays and our tomorrows. And in fact, I believe that looking back can help us to move forward. The Jewish faith has a lot to teach us about the role of our histories and the power of remembering. And maybe that's because the Jewish people have been persecuted so many times, they really have to be able to remember God's faithfulness to them. Their faith celebrates certain holidays such as Purim and Passover, which facilitate a community-wide opportunity to remember. And additionally, several millennia ago, the Hebrews actually crafted physical altars to keep their memories of God's faithfulness alive. And these visual reminders made it impossible for them to forget God's faithfulness. The book of Joshua recounts how one of those came to be. And I'm sure that all of you are familiar with that story. The Israelites had been wandering around in the desert for 40 years, moving toward the promised land, but not yet there. And after Moses died, Joshua became the new leader. They're on the last leg of their epic journey, and they come to a full stop, and the Jordan River is before them, separating them from the promised land. It's swollen. It's swollen. What's the word? Flood stage, sorry. So in the natural realm, there's absolutely no way for them to get across. But then God once again proves that nothing can thwart his purposes. So the moment that the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant step into the river, the water stops flowing, and it allowed them to pass on dry ground. God then directs Joshua to have one representative from each of the 12 tribes to take a stone from the middle of the Jordan, put it on their shoulders, and then build a memorial out of them so that in the future, when their children asked about the memorial, they could say, they remind us that the Jordan River stopped flowing when the Ark of the Lord's covenant went through. These stones will stand as a memorial among the people of Israel forever. And that's from Joshua 4, verses 2 to 7. And in addition to Casey's book, I also just wanted to highlight Michelle Van Loon's book, Moments and Days, which also talks about this very thing. So unlike the Jewish faith, contemporary mainstream Christianity, and I think of like the low church as opposed to high church like Episcopals, doesn't really provide a whole lot of opportunities or traditions for us to remember God's supernatural provision and protection. Thanksgiving might be the closest thing. But that's really focused more on eating certain foods and watching certain sporting events. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with having a day to set aside for that. But I think we Christians need to be a little bit more intentional. One way to think about how to create a ritual of remembering and gratitude might be at communion. For most of us, that's either once a week or once a month. And as we receive communion, if we intentionally take a moment to stop and to remember the very specific, maybe recent or maybe long, long ago ways that God has provided for us, I think that then that could enrich the communion experience. The book of Psalms also provides another example of how we might be intentional in remembering God's faithfulness. In Psalm 77, the author admits that he's in a really difficult place and he seems to feel very forgotten by God. So it reads, "When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long I prayed with hands lifted towards heaven, but my soul was not comforted. I think of God and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for his help." And then there's a very specific pivot. "But then I recall all that you have done, O Lord. I remember your faithful deeds of long ago. They're constantly in my thoughts. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works. O God, your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? You are the God of great wonders. You demonstrate your awesome power among the nations. By your strong arm, you redeem your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph." So the psalmist chooses to remember God's character, which puts the brakes on his descent into despair. And as he does, he encounters hope. And just as the psalmist's words inspire and encourage us today, when we tell others how God has come through in our lives, we not only refresh our own memories, but we probably bring encouragement to some people who might be standing on the banks of the Jordan waiting for God to part the waters. So sharing the ways that God has been faithful to us with others is really important. During the turbulent year that Christopher and I went through, God's faithfulness became our own personal stone of remembrance. It provided the sustenance that we needed to keep going and ultimately helped to reveal a new way forward. And I just want to be clear that remembering is not meant to give us warm fuzzies. It's more like a kale smoothie. It's meant to fortify and to strengthen us so that we can continue to live and to love by his strength. And as we build and revisit memorials to God's faithfulness, I think that we see a distinct through line that serves three purposes. One, as just mentioned, remembering fills us with faith and hope. Two, remembering helps the future to come into focus. How we get to what's next is rarely a straight line from the time that we were converted to how we finish out our lives. There tends to be lots of twists and lots of turns, and sometimes we're in seasons of darkness or in the desert. And there are, for many of us, those seasons can be times when we really struggle to see God or to sense God's presence. They feel very lonely and very isolating, and that might be true for many people today. Nevertheless, I think we always need to hold on to what is truth beyond our feelings, that God is faithful, and to endeavor to keep our moral compass pointed towards Jesus, so that Christ becomes our North Star. And three, remembering shifts the focus off of our weakness onto God's magnificent strength, because God's strength is most present or most visible in our weakness. So one question I think worth spending some time reflecting on is, where has God shown up in your life? When you think back historically to whenever it was that you became a Christian, and even before that time, if you, like me, became a Christian later in life, And what would it look like to set some intentional time aside with a spouse, if you're married, with your children, if you're a parent, or just with friends, and think through what are the ways that God has come through? What are the ways that God has provided for me? I remember once when I was in my mid-20s, this was before Christopher and I were married, and another friend and I just felt led by the Lord to set aside an afternoon and simply give thanks to the Lord for the things that he had done for us and for his character. And we spent, I don't know, it was like 2 or 3 hours just thanking God for who he was and the ways that he had shown up in our lives. And even now, so that was like 30 years ago, that stands out to me as something that was really important and really nourishing for my soul. If you have children, maybe you want to spend some time asking, and they're old enough, spend some time writing down, have them make a journal of the things that the Lord has done, the ways that you as a family have seen God show up. And that could be in prayer, it could be in worship, it could be in acts of service, it could be just in the everyday living of your life that you have a sense of like God really was here, God really met us. And then these become your stones of remembrance. You could even get, little white stones. I found this one on the beach recently, but I'm pretty sure that Michael sells these, a whole bag of them. And write on the stones with a Sharpie very specific things, and keep these stones in a place where when you most need the Lord, when you feel like you're forgetting, if you're feeling discouraged, you can just go and look at these rocks and think like, oh, right, that the Lord has really been faithful to me. And remembering should be a precursor for gratitude and for worship. Even if what God is providing might seem a little bit boring, dare I say, like manna, the same every day. I think back to growing up when I was in elementary school, probably to the time that I was maybe even in high school, I had the same lunch every day. It was peanut butter, Skippy peanut butter, Welch's grape jelly on Wonder Bread. Yes, that very nutritious bread. Cut up carrots and one of those little containers of milk. On special days, maybe I got a devil dog or a sliced up apple. So I didn't really become a Christian until I was in college, but I don't remember having a ton of gratitude for that little sandwich. But when I think back, and I'm, much more aware of the ways that some people live in constant state of hunger without having enough to eat, there should have been something in me that welled up and that felt a sense of gratitude. Evening grace before you have your dinner together. I think it can be very easy for us to just kind of breeze through that and say it in a perfunctory manner. But if we can really stop, Christopher and I have gotten into the habit of saying, Lord, thank you for the farmers who raised this kale. Thank you for the chicken and for its life, which may sound silly, but I think that there's a way that's engendering in us a deeper gratitude for the ways that the Lord provides for us. So if you're in a hard space, think about how is the Lord sustaining you, and be practical. Say thank you for the manna. Like you might be missing the cucumbers and the pomegranates like the Israelites did, but what are the ways, the very specific things that you can be grateful? It could also be helpful to write, to create a timeline from, as far back as you want to go, and think about the ways that the Lord has come in and has redeemed you, has saved you, has provided for you, whether it's through friendships or financial provision or health or healing. I think that when we actually take the time to write that down or to journal it, again, it just refreshes our memory and helps to keep those things present. Another thing you might want to do is sit down with somebody, particularly if you're struggling to understand God's faithfulness, or you're feeling a little bereft. Sit down with someone who's ahead of you, who's years ahead of you, and ask them to share with you some of the ways that the Lord has been faithful to them. Make an appointment with a spiritual director and process some of these things. Whatever you do, don't feel like you have to do it to figure it out on your own. And it's also important for us to remember that God's goodness does not end with us. So he's sustaining and feeding and encouraging us so that we can fulfill the mandate to love other people and to bring his kingdom to earth. So I just want to close by returning to a different section of Psalm 77. I recall all you have done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They are constantly in my thoughts. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works. O God, your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? You are the God of great wonders. You demonstrate your power among the nations. By your strong arm, you redeemed your people. So let me just say a brief prayer. God, help us to remember. Help us to remember the many ways that you have proved yourself faithful to us, to our families, to our communities. Give us the capacity to come to a full stop and recall the ways that you have provided for us, the ways that you have met us, the ways that you have saved us, the ways that you have healed us, and allow us to hold on to those things tightly, particularly when life feels really difficult. And God, we thank you for your faithfulness. Thank you that we can count on you. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, have a good day, everybody.